So, the 3rd of July, 1943, was not an ordinary day in police officer Thorsten Gustafsson's life in the little town of Jokkmokk in Laponia in northern Sweden. He was informed by a group of Sami, Laponians, that they had encountered a group of young men on the mountain, and they were told that they had been 5 originally, but one was left in the hills, dead. So the police officer, he thought that this is something fishy with this situation, and maybe there was some mischief. He were even suspected murder. So he took a trip together with a guide up to the far remote Lake Tarajaure in this district of his, and there he found this image. It was a young man, Petar Stojanovic, from Niš. He was born in Skopje, who was found between a couple of rocks, dead. Now, the police officer then didn't really have time or the ability to interview these other prisoners, but the story was later constructed subsequently when they were moved on to the area of middle Sweden by his friend Petar Stojanovic. So, what we can do through these statements, when a lot of these prisoners of, well, I almost said prisoners of war, but I'll come back to that question later on, what we can do is we can actually, through this story, reconstruct how these persons were moved from their capture in Mount Suva Planina in the vicinity of Niš, and after that taken to the Niš Anhaltelager Semlin, where they were subjected to various interrogations and torture also. His friend Petar Stojanovic lost half of his teeth during these interrogations. After that, they went on to the Stammlager 17B in Krems in Austria, where they were held for a short period of time. They went on the Danube, and from then on, deportation further up to the north to Stargard, in present-day Poland, where they were spending a couple of weeks to a month, and from there to Stettin. After that, after the visit to Stettin, or the period in Stettin, the prisoners were sent on to northern Norway on the boat Kerkplain, and that took them all the way to the central parts of Norway first, to the camp Melhus, which was kind of a transit camp for them, basically. They didn't spend too much time in Melhus, but ended finally up in the place called Rognan, where they worked in a slave labor camp. They were building roads in this area, and from there they fled to Sweden, where they met Gustafsson in the summer of 1943. And the next to final destination was actually the little village or town of Arjeplog, where they were placed in quarantine for a period of time, after which they finally were transported back to a place called Boréns Guest House in the town of Enköping, which is not very far from Uppsala, actually, where Petar Stojanovic, after explaining this entire trip to the police commissioners, police officers, explained that he had the rest of his teeth also pulled out because they were all loose for months after the treatment. Now the question, of course, then is, why Yugoslavs? Why did they take Yugoslavs to northern Norway? This sounds rather, I would say, rather irrational to transport this huge amount of people from this area. Now, in order to understand that, we have to place everything in the context as it was. And the context here is one of counterinsurgency, international law, and the status of partisans. This is crucial. This is why I'm a little bit hesitant, actually, to speak about these prisoners as laborers. I mean, they were not sent to Norway to work, necessarily. Yes, to work, but they were not considered to come back, basically. This is a very special group, I would say. And that has to do with the fact, as you all know, that following Wilhelm Keitel's order about the Kommissarbefehl in September and the ongoing insurrection in Serbia, partisans were actually not to survive. They were not, if they were captured, they were supposed to be killed. So these men, in that sense, are quote unquote, as my project in Sweden is called, living dead. Because if they had not ended up in Germany, they would have been killed in Serbia or Croatia or wherever they were caught. But there were some variations. I will come into that topic. There is also an issue of people, because history is always people. There's always meetings, there's always people thinking about certain things. And here, we can see a connection between Vidkun Quisling, the guy to the left, and Josef Terboven, who was the German general in Germany, just like Franz Böhme was in Serbia. There was a triangle here between these two guys and Albert Speer, who in 1942 intensified the construction work on the Atlantic Wall. The problem for the Germans was, of course, transportation of Swedish iron ore, which was done through the sea route. Now, too many ships were sunk by the British fleet, so taking the raw materials to Germany on the land route would be, of course, much better, much preferable. The problem is that Norway didn't have any roads that were useful. So this was the issue that one needed to solve, of course. Now, the third issue at the same time, of course, is one of the ex-Yugoslavia. I'm not going to go into the details of Yugoslavia. You all know the occupation system, I suppose, and Professor Ristovic talked about that earlier. One person here that is important is, of course, Eugen Dido Kvaternik, the person responsible for the persecution policy in the independent state of Croatia. Because at the same time as we had a need for labor in one part of Europe, there was an excess, quote-unquote, population in another part of Europe. But perhaps the spider in the web here, in this little story, is actually August Meissner, who several people here have mentioned, and Milan Koljanin just talked about him a while ago. Interesting story about this guy was that, did you know where he was before he came to Serbia? Well, he was the police commissar in Trondheim, in Norway. So I can just imagine the situation, him coming to Serbia and then hearing about, oh, they need laborers up there, and I have a pool of people that we can get rid of and can use for slave labor. We are going to shoot them anyway. So this is a way to solve a practical problem, which paradoxically, and this is important, this is what distinguishes this group from many other groups, let some of these people at least survive. Now, if we look at the Yugoslav prisoners of war, we can also keep in mind that they were captured from two distinct territories. I want to draw your attention to this map. First of all, there were between 4,000 and 4,300 prisoners. We are in the process of finalizing a database on all of these prisoners, and this, depending a little bit on how we define them, the figures vary. We also have an additional 250 to 300 tot workers in Norway. What we can see on this map, and this is crucial, this is that we had two regions where the prisoners were captured from. One was Serbia proper, German-occupied Serbia, and one was the independent state of Croatia. Now, if you draw attention to the maps here and the dots, what you will notice is that on the Serbian map, there is a lot more dots than there is on the Croatian map. And the reason for this is that altogether there was a 64% death rate among the Yugoslavs. And that is to compare to the Russian prisoners of war in Norway, and there was 120,000 of those. They had a death rate of 15%. The Polish, particularly Polish tot workers, had a death rate of 5%. When it comes to Serbia, what we see is selective targeting of partisans and communists or communist sympathizers, some nationalist Chetniks, but mainly communists. And this is illustrated by the map. Here the German authorities tried to identify those who were communists and send them on. So they were picking people in many different spots. In the independent state of Croatia, however, you have a situation of indiscriminate targeting of civilians, selective targeting of partisans, and in the process also getting rid of criminals that you do not wish to have. Therefore, these round dots is the size of each group. And in this map, you can see in this area, quite a lot of them. And this is, which of course shouldn't surprise anybody, it's Banija Kordun and that area. And if we look into the lists of prisoners from these villages, we very often see one surname, and then we see a whole bunch of names with the same father's name. So the Ustash authorities did not selectively target partisans, they just wanted to rid themselves of a population, and this was one way to achieve this. And this, as I said, sets this group apart from some of the other groups we have talked about today. But it's also evident if you look into the age structure of the group. Now, in the case of the German-occupied territory, what we see here is that this is where 50% of the prisoner population ends up. So it's men in military age, usually, and you can also see the time span, from about 20 or 18 until 50, 55. This is a partisan population. In the case of the independent state of Croatia, the time span is much higher, although it's actually an error in the lower end here. It's not zero age, of course, we're not taking babies up there. But you can see that the average age, which is indicated by the black line in the box, was much higher in the independent state of Croatia case. Now this is important, I think, because that tells us a little bit more about what was the underlying reason for the deportation. In the case of the German occupation authorities, it was to, well, get rid of the partisans, but also to extract some labor. In the case of the independent state of Croatia, it was to rid yourself of an undesired population, irrespectively of whether they were partisans or not. Now, what we can say about this group is that there were 4 transports, altogether in 20 camps from Rjukan, which was mainly known for being the place where the heavy water was produced in Norway, which you're quite familiar with. Most of the prisoners, however, were sent to northern Norway, all the way up to Karasjok on the Finnish-Norwegian border. It's far above the Arctic Circle, obviously. Now, here in this group, however, I should mention, I'm also including the tot workers, not only the prisoners, and so to speak, quote-unquote, voluntary laborers. They were in the south, mainly. Major camps were around Trondheim, Mo i Rana, and Narvik. This is the central part of northern Norway. And the interesting thing about these camps is that they were originally under SS administration. It was the SS that organized the camp system in Norway for these slave laborers. And this was also known among the prisoners as the bloodiest years, up until April 1943. That's where a vast majority of all the prisoners died. After that, the treatment got much better when the Wehrmacht took over. So we see a clear reduction also statistically in mortality rates. And there is a discussion whether or not this had to do with this status shift, and it probably did have to do with that. But whether these prisoners were actually received a status as prisoners of war after April 1943 is a bit more complicated and questionable. Now, when it comes to life in these camps, you can see some pictures of that. Obviously, we're talking about a very cold region of Norway, terrible cold. We have stories of immense suffering, and you can see on these emaciated men down to the picture to the left. They worked on infrastructure, military installation. The filth and hygiene situation was absolutely terrible. They did not have very often this type of barracks we saw in the presentation just now. They were living in tent-like constructions often. Widespread disease, dysentery, typhoid fever, and beatings, torture, deprivation. And there is one interesting story about that from NN, name unknown, who was a guard in one of the camps. And he explained the situation like this. I'll just briefly go through a couple of comments. The treatment of the Serbs was plain inhuman, he said, and it is inexplicable why the German guards tormented them and tortured them so much. Even the Germans must have understood that sooner or later they would be held accountable for the type of cruelty that was a daily occurrence in the camps. The food could hardly be called food for human beings. The health conditions could not be worse. All carried visible traces of malnourishment, but those who were starving were much better off than those who were ill. Incidentally, most of them were really, who were really ill, most of them were really ill, and the most common diseases were scabies, tuberculosis, and gonorrhea, probably diarrhea, actually. It says gonorrhea in the quote. So the patients with scabies were particularly gruesome to watch. Most of them had open sores all over the bodies. And what happened with these prisoners when they got very ill, it was simply taken out and shot. There was also an outbreak. One of the most infamous incidents with these prisoners was in Beisfjord, close to Narvik in the far north of Norway, where there was an outbreak of suspected typhus fever in June 1942, which resulted in, there was 3 barracks there, and the authorities had resulted to execute the prisoners who were ill. They brought up the first contingent of people and shot them. And then the next group refused to go out from the barracks, and they set petrol to the barracks and burned the people alive. So some 700 people were killed in this instance. What is interesting is what they also placed guards outside the houses of the local Norwegians and told them that if anybody stuck their heads out to watch through the window, they would be shot. Some did anyways, actually. Here is the camp. You see these tent-like constructions. And this is actually a real picture from the burning of the barracks with the people inside. Some of these Norwegians, person just took a photo. And here is the commemoration stone at Beisfjord today, or not so long ago. Now, of course, we have to remember that the prisoners were not simply accepting violence. There were various defense strategies that they could have, and one that we will come back to is that of flight. Luckily, Norway looks as it does. It's rather thin in the north part of the country, so it's not so far anywhere, actually, to go to Sweden. That was a very important way to get away from the worst violence. Another way was to make oneself useful as a capo in the camp, as an equivalent of a capo, barracks head. These were very often criminals that took these positions, but not always. Another interesting, actually, means of survival was that of organization. Particularly if you were a communist, they were quite well organized in the camp, and it was very important to belong to a certain group that could help you out in trouble. There was also in the camps and afterwards high levels of conflict between the left and the right, so to speak. Communists fighting others, and back and forth. Theft, denunciation is something we also saw a lot of the kind of immoral behavior in the camp, and killings even. At the end of the séjour in the camps, the prisoners themselves murdered, yeah, they did, of course, 9 of the former capos themselves. And this picture is quite interesting. It's also from the place where Stevan Stefanovic was, in Rognan, was one of the prisoners in 1943, I think this is. Milos Banyac tried to flee, and he was caught by a stone and shot by his German guard. And at that spot, somebody wrote a cross with his blood. I don't remember if it was him or one of his who was with him. And after that, the municipality, every once in a while, fills in these colors on the exact spot. And this was actually written about by Desanka Maksimovic in her Pesmi iz Norveške. So, as I said, 100 people came to Sweden. They settled mainly in the southern half of Sweden, from Stockholm and down south, very few in the north. Although they fled to the north, but they were then resettled. Interestingly, but with the Yugoslavs, that there was no internment on them, because as the German authorities did not recognize the Yugoslavs as prisoners of war, neither did the Swedish authorities. And in wartime, if there is a fighting soldier that is an active soldier, you're actually supposed to intern them. And there were internment camps, for instance, for Soviet former prisoners of war. Which means that actually the Yugoslavs had lots of interaction with the Swedish authorities and Swedish civilians in the areas where they lived. And also quite an opportunity to engage in various forms of political activism. Adding to this was, of course, other events, and I would just draw your attention to a little bit of that. What we see of this group that fled to Sweden, a very substantial part actually ended up in Uppsala. This is a modern picture of Uppsala where we know exact address where they lived, so we can trace them quite well throughout this 4th biggest city in Sweden, but not so very big. And there, when they settled in the various places, they developed very strong interpersonal relations with Swedish civilians, friendships that lasted, well, have actually never ended, I think. There's a friendship organization even active today regarding these prisoners. Adoptions, interestingly enough, happened, with several young men, 15 to 17 years of age, were adopted by Swedish families. And also love. A certain number of children were actually produced during this period of time, which is, of course, a very positive thing. And just to give you one interesting example, some of you might know this person. A couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, I interviewed one of the prisoners, and his name is, it's up to the right, his name is Žarko Vidović. He died last year, it seems, yeah. He was born in Tešanj, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and captured in October 1941, sent to Narvik, and he fled to Uppsala in 1943. When he told me that in the interview, I asked him, "Oh, you were in Uppsala, because that's where I'm sitting." And I asked him, "What did you do in Uppsala?" And he says, "Well, of course I studied." And I asked him, "But actually it cost quite a lot of money at those days to study in Uppsala." "Oh," he says, "Martin Holson Holmdahl arranged a scholarship for me." Now, Martin Holson Holmdahl at the time was probably a doctoral student, maybe, or not even that. No, he probably wasn't even that. And later became the vice chancellor of Uppsala University during 1978 to 1998, and he died 2 years ago. So here he is with our current vice chancellor of the university. But what happened with Stefanovic? You remember the guy in the beginning? The young man in the stone? Well, actually, I found him about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's interesting, but I will keep you waiting a little bit more. A certain number of these men who tried to flee the camps, they perished. It's an extremely inhospitable area, the inland of northern Sweden. Even in the summer, at night, it gets easily below zero. And you can get very lost because it's not very populated. Some of them, unfortunately, also died after liberation in 1945. Among them, there is, for instance, today, 5 crosses in a town called Östersund in northern Sweden, where there was a sanatorium for people inflicted with tuberculosis. And here you can see 2 interesting pictures. To the left, you have a picture from the burial taken by the nurses at this sanatorium of Milutin Vasiljevic. And to the right, you see his current cross still standing. Now, Stefan Stefanovic was actually buried in Jokkmokk, in Swedish Laponia, and he still lies there. I found out 3-4 weeks ago. Unfortunately, there is no gravestone or no marking of his grave. I got this picture from the place, from the people up, from the local priest. He says, he is here, we don't know exactly where, because they didn't know his name at the time, so there was no possibility of marking it up like that. But I found his death certificate, which mentions that it wasn't a killing. He had simply died from exhaustion, even though he was only 18 years old. And what is also more interesting is when I looked closer at the picture, I found another mystery. There is actually another ex-Yugoslav. And what is his name? I can't see it. Božidar Đurić Javor also died in 1943, buried there as well. So I have to solve this puzzle as well, I think. So this is basically what I wanted to talk to you about, and I thank you for the attention.